let's just give a little background to what logic is. In terms of modal logic, or what's called modal logic, there are three categories. The first is a possible state of affairs, or something that is possible. The second is impossible, and the third is necessary. Now, let me break down what that means. Something that is possible is, for example, this presentation, meaning it exists, but it doesn't have to exist and may not exist in the future. It could exist or it could not exist. It didn't have to exist, and it could fail to exist, and it could be otherwise. This is what possible existence is, such as this presentation, this table here, or virtually almost anything else that you can possibly think of. Now, something that is impossible, an example of this, is a married bachelor or a square circle. A married bachelor can't exist because just what it means to be a bachelor is the opposite of to be married. So a married bachelor is literally a contradiction. A married bachelor would be a married unmarried man, which doesn't make any sense. Same thing with a square circle. So things that are impossible entail contradictions, as I've just expressed. Something that is necessary, at least for a Muslim or a theist, would be something like God's existence. That is to say that God couldn't fail to exist. He must exist, and it's not a possibility in which he could not exist. Other potential examples of this would be things like 1 + 1 = 2. There's no possibility in which 1 + 1 could equal 3 or something other than 2. Likewise, many logicians think that the law of non-contradiction is a necessary law as well, such that there's no true contradictions in reality, such as a married bachelor or a square circle, etc. So those are the three categories of thought: possibility, impossibility, and necessity. For something to be possible, it must be logically coherent. It cannot be possible if it's incoherent. This is a minimum standard for truth. Now, I'm making the claim, as I have previously, that the Orthodox doctrine of the Incarnation is a logical impossibility, such that if it is logically incoherent, then it couldn't possibly be true, because in order for something to be true, it cannot be incoherent. What about true contradictions? Can true contradictions in reality exist? Can married bachelors in reality exist? Can true contradictions apply to the divine, to God himself? Can God quite literally be a contradiction in the same way that a married bachelor or square circle is? Well, some Christians actually believe that that is yes to that question. Now, why? Because of all of the problems that I've been going over thus far, and all of the attempts to try to solve those problems have not worked, but yet because they still think that the doctrine is true, they say, look, it's just a true contradiction, and we need to accept it. So, one example of this, and again, I'm not trying to represent that as the mainstream view. It is an extremely minority view that is held, but it is held nevertheless. And a very famous and well-known logician by the name of J.C. Beale, who's done a lot of work in the area of logic, especially on the liar's paradox and things of that nature. He wrote an entire book on this, in which he goes through the problems, he shows how it's contradictory, he shows how all solutions thus far have not worked to solve the problem, but because he's still a Christian, he says, look, it's contradictory, but it's true. So he accepts true contradictions. So he says this in his book called The Contradictory Christ. The quest to consistentize Christ, or the quest to give a consistent solution to what Richard Cross in 2011 famously dubbed the fundamental problem of Christology, enjoys a long, fascinating history, and the quest continues in full force up through today. So he says, look, the quest to answer this fundamental problem, which Richard Cross calls the fundamental problem of Christology, which we're going to go into, which is essentially how could a single person be, for example, omniscient and have all knowledge and yet be ignorant at the same time. these sort of contradictory properties ascribed to the same person or being. He says that enjoys a long and fascinating history, and the quest to solve that problem is in still full force today. So in 2,000 years, it's never been solved. This is what he's saying. So now he goes on to say, but I believe that the quest should end. Why? I believe that Christian thinkers should accept the contradiction of Christ. Christ is a contradictory being. So goes the central thesis of this book. At the crux, now listen to this, at the crux of Christian theology is a contradiction, namely, Christ Jesus is a being of whom some claims are both true and false. That's it. Now this is not just some guy off the street. This guy is a logician. His resume speaks for itself. You can just look him up. He's the one who actually wrote the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on on the liar's paradox. He wrote the entry for that, right? So this is not just some random guy or even a low-level Christian apologist. He's somebody who's actually worked on logic, and he's thoroughly examined all attempts to avoid contradictions when it comes to Christ. And he argues the same thing. In order to avoid the contradiction, you have to take a heretical position. You're either left with a contradiction or a heresy. This is what he explicitly states in other places in his book. So, what